You know the name Jimmy Doolittle, the hero of the Doolittle raid and commander of the 8th Air Force in Europe. But do you know how he went on to fly more combat missions and nearly blew the Allies' greatest secret of the war? In this video, we will cover how Jimmy Doolittle, in the months after the Doolittle raid, went against orders and took on a massive risk in 1943 and 44 in aerial combat missions over Europe, and how this bold risk almost cost the Americans dearly. Speaking of risk, let's talk about one of the greatest risks that you can face today, heart health. And the best thing that you can do to support a healthy heart is to use this video's sponsor, Human. Human Super Beats heart chews support healthy blood pressure and they taste great. They've sent me some to try, and while working on this video, a couple of days has given me the extra energy that I needed to get it done on time. And the benefits are no joke. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the antioxidants in Super Beats are clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting healthy blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. So don't wait until it's too late to start caring about your heart health. Double your potential with Super Beats Heart Chews. Get a free 30-day supply of Super Beats Heart Chews on all bundles and 15% off your first order by going to getsuperbeats.com and using code TJ3. That's getsuperbeets.com, code TJ3. Support TJ3 History and your heart at the same time with Human. Now, enjoy. It is late 1942, and now 6 months after the famous raid on Tokyo, Jimmy H. Doolittle has now returned to the United States to resume his role as a general in the Army Air Force. And just recently, he has been promoted to the commanding general of the 12th Air Force in North Africa. And because most historical stories related to Doolittle cover his Tokyo raid or his exploits as commander of the 8th Air Force, most people believe that after the Doolittle raid, this was the end of his serious combat missions. But in reality, this could not be farther from the truth. This can be seen in the very first flight that General Doolittle took in his new position, a ferry flight to the North African theater. This would be on November 6th of 1942, when Doolittle boarded a B-17 and took off from Herne, England to Gibraltar to assume his role as the commander of the 12th Air Force. But somewhere en route, this B-17 was ambushed by 4 German Ju-88s. And the Ju-88, for those that do not know, was a formidable bomber interceptor when no fighter escorts were present, and this would be the case today. They would hit Doolittle's aircraft hard, doing damage to the fortress and even wounding the co-pilot. But fortunately, Doolittle would survive, landing in Gibraltar and escaping a very close call, to say the least. It could have easily been Doolittle himself who was injured, or worse, potentially changing the outcome of the war. But it was not, and he landed safely at his destination. And you might be thinking, TJ, how do you know all this to be true? What is your source? Well, my source is the actual logbook of Jimmy Doolittle himself, which I was able to obtain a digital copy of from the McDermott Library at UT Dallas. So as we go through this story, I'll be reading it from here and listing the combat missions and details for you to see. So let's continue. Once he landed in Gibraltar, Doolittle assumed command and began to lead the 12th, emphasizing coordination and modernized tactics to create an effective air force over North Africa. However, this is not the only unique thing that he would do as a leader. Doolittle, deep down, was a combat pilot. Many had thought that he should not lead the mission to Tokyo in 1942, but he did it anyways. And now, in North Africa, his leadership style would be no different. General Jimmy Doolittle flew multiple combat missions with his 12th Air Force, starting just 2 weeks into his arrival, where he flew with the 97th Bomb Group to strike an enemy airfield on November 21st. And you might think that this would be enough, a general taking the time to fly actual combat missions with his men. But this is only the beginning. After winter, Doolittle essentially began a combat tour in North Africa, flying as frequently as a regular combat crew member in February of 1943. And the best part? Since he was the commander of the entire 12th Air Force, he consistently alternated units, flying a different aircraft nearly every single mission. This would all begin on February 8th, where he flew his first combat mission of 1943 as he took off in a B-26, but had to turn back early due to engine trouble. The following day, on February 9th, he made it to the target, flying as co-pilot with the 301st Bomb Group on a bombing mission in a B-17 Flying Fortress. The next day, February 10th, he flew in a B-25 Mitchell with the 310th Bomb Group as a co-pilot on an anti-shipping raid. A few days later, on February 13th, Doolittle arrived at the airbase of the 17th Bomb Group in Talergma. This was a special unit to Doolittle, as it was the same group that had launched 16 B-25s off of the USS Hornet 1 year earlier. Now, however, they were flying the B-26, and the general would proudly fly with them again, but this time as a co-pilot on a bombing mission to strike German targets instead of the Japanese. And according to his logbook, his Marauders actually lost their escort, but made it through safely nonetheless. The missions kept coming, and Doolittle kept flying, as one of the most important men in the entire Army, braving combat sorties with every group he could fly with. February 15th, a B-17 raid with the 97th. The 16th, another anti-shipping raid in a B-25 of the 310th. And the 17th, for the third day in a row, back to the B-26 with the 17th Bomb Group. And then, just when it sounds like his flights couldn't get any more fascinating, his next combat mission came 5 days later, on February 23rd, but not with the U.S. Army Air Force. Instead, this mission would be flown on a Vickers Wellington with the 330 wing of the Royal Air Force. This would be because at this point, Doolittle had become not only the commander of the 12th, but now was leading the entire Northwest African Strategic Air Force, which even included some RAF squadrons. With this crew of Brits, Doolittle would again make it home safely after another bombing run, despite the fact that this one would be at night, and he noted that their motor cow blew off. And speaking of British allies, that leads us to one of the most critical details of this entire story. The fact that General Jimmy Doolittle, by flying these combat missions, was going directly against the orders of his allies. Beginning in late 1942, an important detail changed in the American war effort. This would be the fact that the British Allies had successfully broken the German Enigma code, allowing them to read nearly every message that the Germans were sending, and now they had opted to share this information with the Yanks. This information, dubbed the Ultra Secret, was the most closely guarded secret of the war, as it gave the Allies the German moves and their information before things even happened. This was critical to winning the war, but in order to properly utilize it, the Brits recognized that they had to relay these transmissions to their American allies, specifically their generals. Generals like Jimmy Doolittle. Just before 1943, Doolittle was briefed on this ultra secret and began receiving the confidential transmissions in order to make the best leadership decisions for the 12th Air Force. And because of this, he was ordered not to fly combat missions, especially not over enemy territory, as only a handful of men on the planet knew of the ultra secret. And if one of them were to fall into German hands and reveal this secret, it could cost the Allies their most valuable advantage in the entire war. So, after being briefed on Ultra, General Jimmy Doolittle was officially placed on a no-fly list. But if there is anything that had been learned about Jimmy H. Doolittle by this point, It was that nothing could keep him out of the air. So despite this ultra secret, Jimmy Doolittle continued to lead the 12th Air Force in the only way he knew how, by observing their tactics and flying combat missions himself. On March 10th, he went up again with the 97th Bomb Group, then again 1 month later in another one of their fortresses on April 10th. 2 weeks after this, on the 27th, he took part in an anti-shipping raid with the 321st Bomb Group. The following month, on May 10th, another bombing of an airfield with the 99th. Then, on the 17th, a night raid to a German port with his good friends from the RAF. Then, on June 5th, Doolittle bombed battleships with the 99th Bomb Group and their B-17s, before going up once again a few days later on the 10th for a raid with the 320th. And in case you might be thinking that some of these can't possibly be true, we can easily double check. And here in the records for the 320th, we can see their own combat crew listings for this mission, and appropriately, we see none other than Jimmy Doolittle penciled in to one of the air crews for this mission, flying combat just like the leader he was. But after this month, the missions began to slow down, likely because Doolittle saw the writing on the wall that he was soon to be promoted, and didn't want to mess that up. Or perhaps he may have even been ordered to minimize that activity to ensure his own safety. But regardless, the mission slowed substantially, and he would fly combat only a few more times. On July 19th, he went up with the 97th Bomb Group once again. And then 1 month later, on August 9th, he flew another B-17 with the 9th Bomb Group. And then finally, on September 1st and 2nd, he flew 2 more final night missions with the 331st Wing of the RAF and their Wellington bombers. And shortly after this, in late 1943, General Doolittle was off, headed back to England for a brand new job. And according to his logbook, this would be the final combat mission flown for Jimmy Doolittle in the war. And this might lead one to believe that the ultra-secret was safe and that Doolittle had avoided blowing the confidential information. But that wasn't the case just yet. In January of 1944, Jimmy Doolittle had been promoted to the commander of the 8th Air Force, a job that even he recognized carried a very heavy weight, as the war in Europe was now reaching its climax. As he settled into England, Doolittle was assigned a new intelligence chief, Brigadier General Arthur Vanaman. Vanaman had recently been assigned to help Doolittle manage the ultra intel and other information that would need to be disseminated before making its way all the way to Doolittle. But he had just arrived in the 8th Air Force and was trying to learn about the men that he was commanding. So he sent a request to Jimmy Doolittle, asking to participate in one single mission as a part of this orientation with his new force. Reluctantly, knowing that he had little room to say no based on his own track record, Doolittle agreed and permitted Vanaman to fly one mission for orientation, despite the fact that he had already been briefed on the ultra secret. And unfortunately, this would prove to be a very costly decision. On June 27th of 1944, Arthur Vanaman took off in a B-17 named Big Barn Smell from the 379th Bomb Group. This would be for observational purposes, hoping to help his understanding of the men and units that he was helping lead. After all, General Doolittle had done this many times and had always gotten home safely. But apparently, Arthur Vanaman did not have the same luck as the famous Doolittle, and this mission would go quite differently. Over the French countryside, Big Barn Smell was hit by flak, and the fortress caught fire. Quickly, smoke began to fill the cabin, and the pilot ordered the crew to bail out. General Arthur Vanaman and 4 other aviators followed this order and leapt from the aircraft, parachuting down into enemy-occupied France. But then, just a few moments later, the remaining crew realized that the fire could be contained and decided to stay with the aircraft, flying Big Barn Smell all the way home to England. But this was too late for Vanaman and the other aviators. Upon landing, the other 4 crew members were able to evade safely and make it back to friendly territory. But the general was quickly captured as he had been injured while bailing out, making him the only member of the plane to fall into German hands. This would no doubt come as crushing news to Doolittle, who had approved the flight and now potentially blown the ultra-secret. But fortunately, somehow the Germans never learned what Vanaman knew about the top-secret project, and the Allies were able to continue reading all of the German encrypted messages. Nonetheless, it was far too close of a call for Doolittle, and Arthur Vanaman would become one of the highest-ranking men captured by the Germans in World War II. According to the logbook, General Jimmy Doolittle never again flew combat during the war, but instead led the entire 8th Air Force to a decisive victory over the Luftwaffe, paving the way for the Allied triumph. No doubt this would be due in part to the lessons that he had learned by choosing to brave the odds and fly combat with his men. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.